You are listening to Art Destinations, a podcast where we host fortnightly conversations with artists and thinkers living and or working on islands to see how these unique places shape imaginations. This season will be set in Lutruwita, Tasmania, following on from our Venice series. Hello, my name is Sarah Rhodes, an artist based in Lutruwita. I am in conversation with Ellen Dahl, an artist who grew up in the Arctic north of Norway and is now living and working on Gadigal country in Sydney. We talk about her recent work that questions whether the landscapes of Lutruwita and Svalbard, north of Arctic Circle, share something in common. Do the similarities and differences offer us another way of understanding how we see and what we feel about the world? Ellen is represented by Melbourne gallery This Is No Fantasy, and you can see Ellen's work on our Instagram page, artdestinations.podcast. Subscribe to Art Destinations on your hosting platform so you don't miss an episode, and even leave a review. Your contribution supports us. Hi Ellen, welcome to Art Destinations Tasmania. It's really great to have you on the show.
Thanks for having me. I am excited to be here.
So this is an exciting year for you. You won the National Photography Prize at MAMA in Albury earlier this year. You've just returned from exhibiting at Unseen Amsterdam, the contemporary art photography fair for emerging and established artists. And next week, you're having your first solo show with the Melbourne gallery, This Is No Fantasy. What a year after completing your PhD, it must feel like a bit of a fantasy.
It does. I have to admit it's been a thrilling year, a lot of firsts that I feel has fundamentally influenced my practice and how I move forward from here. So yes, it feels a bit like a fantasy.
So we've known each other for quite a long time. We were in a photography, crit group in Sydney, and then we were lucky enough to study or do our PhDs together in Tasmania. And so I watched your work evolve. You've been making relationships between the peripheries north of the Arctic Circle, north of the Arctic Circle and Lutruwita, Tasmania. What drew you to make these relationships?
The north-south was a theme that's always been part of my life. My father was a southerner and my mother was a northerner. And I moved between north and south within Norway, where there is an awareness of these things because the climatic changes in a relatively long, narrow country. You become aware of these changes and geography. I think that my own experience of the periphery, as I am born in the northern periphery of far north Norway, and feeling a sense of connection when I first visited Tasmania was my first true kind of connection with an Australian environment, which I had been fascinated with, but not had a sense of connection with, because I always felt like such a tourist visitor, and so I should. And while I still feel that about Tasmania, there was also something different about Tasmania that I felt kind of bypassed that connected back to my own origins of a peripheral understanding of the world.
So where did you grow up?
So I grew up relatively nomadic. I moved around a lot between the north and the south of Norway, but I was born on an island in far north Norway, and I also spent years in primary school living on the northernmost island of mainland Norway, as we call it, because there is a part which we'll talk about later probably, which is Svalbard, which is a uniquely separated piece of land from the mainland Norway. Yeah, so I don't know my father because he died when I was very young, so I don't have a relationship to him. So I grew up in the north with my mother before she remarried another southerner. And for a long time, these things were not kind of big conversations for me. It was probably overshadowed by my own curiosity to who my father might have met, rather than what my heritage or linear bloodlines might be, which has kind of become something that I've become aware of, living here in Australia, where there is such a conscious dialogue around cultural backgrounds and heritage in such a multicultural country. And also, as I have explored the landscape so intensely in my practice, I've started to wonder why I do that. Why am I so obsessed with exploring these concepts to understand not just myself, but also the world around me? And through one of my cousins, who's a scientist and a very avid researcher, has done a major research on our family and our lineage on our mother's side, their sisters, including full DNAs and so forth. We've become increasingly aware of the fact that we have quite strong lineage of both Sami and Kven, which is another minority group in the northern Norway. And it's kind of started to make slowly sense to myself that there is this kind of wondrous, independent, and then this kind of need of speaking back to the land to understand myself and the world, really. So I've kind of placed myself more in that context of my own cultural connections between being Norwegian, Sami, and Kven these days.
Okay. I moved to Tasmania with my son when he was 4 from Sydney so that he could have this sort of magical childhood of open spaces and this sort of island way of living. And I wonder what it was like for you growing up in Arctic Norway when it was a very different experience from Tasmania, probably more remote where you were. So do you have any little childhood stories that you could share?
I don't, top of my head, have a story. What I can share is that I have these memories of playing outdoor a lot. And we were made to play outdoors. So there's this psyche up north, and not just north, in Norway in general, that kids needs to go out. Babies sleep, have their daytime sleep in their prams, as long as it's under minus 10 degrees. They'll put their babies out in their sheepskin sleeping bags and they have 2 hours sleep. Fresh air is important, I guess, because we spend so much indoor time otherwise. So my memories is seasonal plays that is, so in summer we would roam the coastline looking for things that are washed up or sea urchins pick off their spikes. And you get these beautiful patterns as you dry them out and find secret places where we would hang out. And, the days were endless as well, so that you stayed out really late. We wouldn't be particularly old, but we could easily stay out till 11 o'clock at night. And our parents were pretty relaxed about that. In winter, it was one of the things that I remember well was we had this, we loved putting layers and layers and layers of socks on. We had, full puffer pants, puffer jackets, big hats with strings under our chins and our mittens and fleece and all that stuff. But we loved putting layers and layers and layers of socks on instead of shoes because it was like walking barefoot on the snow. It was this soft kind of giving, and it was amazing to not have shoes on. And go out. And then we would all sorts of ways of coming down the hill and sledding and competing. Anything from one of the things we used to love was to get a big garbage bag, cut 2 holes in each corner and pull your legs through. And you go so fast. You can't go faster on any other kind of device than sitting on a garbage plastic bag down. Not very ecological. Yeah, so my memory of living there is deeply connected to what was unique about living there. And as you said, they're remote, small towns. So you are forced to entertain yourself with the place you're in, with the landscape. And I'm sure there are similar ways of exploring and experiencing Tasmania, is that the place itself becomes your life and your source of entertainment. And you've got to kind of get in it. And I think that's pretty special.
Yeah, and not many people get to experience that.
Or would know how to, I think, almost sometimes as well, those kind of small things. Having taken my own kids to Norway in winter, the things that really stuck with them was going out, going downhill, getting the hot dogs out on the stick and having a fire in the snow and grilling hot dogs after having played for 3 hours with, crusty red cheeks. Those kind of small things are pretty special.
That's cute. Very descriptive. I know when I ask people in Tasmania if, what role the island or the place has on their psyche, they often say that they don't think about it, they just are where they are. But I think it would be really hard not to be aware, especially growing up there where you're really on the edge. It's like a frontier, and it's the climate being so cold, it would be very hard to not be aware that you were really at the northernmost point. Is that what you felt when you were growing up? Did you have that feeling?
I think that you kind of accept it as everyday life when you're there, but I think it is what I brought with me as my own attraction to the periphery and why I ended up doing a research project on the periphery, because it is exactly what you say, is these places at the edge give you this kind of enhanced experience of yourself in the element, that meeting point between the human and non-human, this kind of sense of time shifting, these overlapping timescales of, human time and deep time. They are just very prevalent at the edge or at the periphery as a kind of concept, and I've been drawn to them for a while. So it makes sense that I kind of seek them out and I find them a place where my mind opens up and I am able to respond and experience the place, which is what I'm really drawn to. And it doesn't have to be my own place or my own story I seek to tell, but it is the language that I feel very comfortable to work with.
Okay. So, you were living in Sydney and you decided to come down to Tasmania and start making work, and you were very open about that, not knowing what you were going to look for. What drew you there in the first place?
I'd visited Tasmania just as a tourist and instantly felt a connection to it in some way without being able to explain that clearly. But then I did come back and I did one photo shoot down there. Came back on my own and I traveled down south that time. And I think that when I decided to do my PhD and I was looking for places to continue this kind of new research strand that I'd started, which was concept of the island, the periphery, the landscape, interwoven with photography, Tasmania made sense. And also wanting to access Tasmania further on an authentic level that wasn't just me jetting in, taking what I wanted and move out. I felt it was important to connect and spend time and be guided by people there in how I approached it.
So what was your process when you were making your way around Tasmania? What did you end up looking for? What did you find that found you connecting with the other outer edge in Svalbard?
Originally, actually, I would start back at the beginning really with my project, which I called Field Notes from the Edge. I had set out to kind of bring or look for connections between far north Norway, where I am from, and what I might find in Tasmania that kind of connected them somehow in one way or another, or just openly seeing whether there were similarities or not. I didn't necessarily know if there would be. So with Tasmania, my plan was to spend time down there and just move around and see what it would give me, what I found, spend time and thought about it, and then reflected on what I'd seen and what it was that I'd come across. And then I go back again with a bit more of a purpose, continuing to explore what it was. And the thing that I kind of got particularly interested in was many things, but the thing that ended up being the kind of main subject for me for this project was the hydroelectric industry of Tasmania. You travel around in this incredible perceived wilderness of Tasmania, which is just stunning. You see these incredible kind of lakes stayed by tannin. So these lakes were constructed lakes and cut-off river systems to support the island's hydroelectric industry. And I later found out that in these UNESCO protected wilderness areas, which had been protected, and then the government lifted the protections to allow the industry to develop, and then they slapped the protection back on again. So an interesting stories around this idea. And it was just this kind of paradoxical kind of concept between wilderness and human intervention, which are something I also ended up finding in Svalbard, which was this kind of perceived north-south wilderness frontier places that both had these surprising resource extractions and kind of unexpected intermingling of human and the non-human in the wilderness that I found fascinating to work with. And so the project became on these two themes, so coal mining that still exists in Svalbard, bizarrely, and the hydroelectric industry in Tasmania. A good example would be how I ended up choosing the locations to have this conversation about the fake lakes, which was the idea. The fake lake was something I draw to that idea of these, obviously these lakes not being real, and also what the locals had called Lake Petter, or Fake Petter as they called it after it had been flooded. Driving out to Stratgordon the first time and coming to that enormous divide that is the dam wall that is out there, which is also, it's pretty amazing, it's pretty spectacular. But it also, for me, it was just too iconic, too obvious of a choice, even though it was just this kind of clear boundary between the wilderness and us. It was kind of fascinating. It was like, it didn't speak to the kind of more quieter, melancholic theme that I was looking for, where I felt that time slowed down and it wasn't so didactic, I guess, in a way. Driving around, and it's not always easy to find these. They try and stop you from actually accessing all these little dam walls that exist around. So the two sites that I worked with was the Serpentine Dam, which is it's a part of Lake Gordon. So weaving my way around the area around Lake Gordon and the Gordon Dam wall, I came across other dams, smaller dams, less obvious dams that also allowed for the environment around it to kind of sit in contrast to it more. One of these dams were the Serpentine Dam, and then on another trip going kind of north of Queenstown now towards Tula, there was Lake Mackintosh that is also a smaller, not so obvious dam system where there is actually two dam walls in there. So together, these three dam walls were the ones that I ended up focusing on. They're also a lot because of the way they were placed in the environment, they were surrounded by beautiful landscapes or Tasmanian wilderness. And they were beautiful, but at the same time, you had this concrete wall kind of cutting through it. And, in many ways, also this kind of black tannin stained water that is a natural occurrence. It's not pollution as such, but it is also a result of peatland being flooded. So it's not natural in the end either. So it's natural matter, but it's not natural occurrence as such either. So it's interesting.
Those hydro sites are quite spectacular because they're so desolate, really. A lot of the places are really in these sort of inhospitable landscapes. And then you've got these concrete walls, like fences sort of as channels of water. And as places to visit, they're not really places that you would go. So they're very sort of intimate and private, but vast and incredibly impressive. And then you're driving through these ancient forests, essentially, to get to these places that are so constructed. Yeah, so it's a real juxtaposition. So I can see why, you were drawn there.
But subtle. It's not
so
this,
subtle.
Yeah, not this kind of loud, dialogue about how we are interfering with stuff. Just this more subtle, what I find fascinating, kind of point of slightly different perspective on.
Okay. So when you're looking at these pictures, is it very clear where each one is if you're presenting them together?
Yes and no. By being conscious of seasons and weather, I kind of neutralize as much as I can their distinctness to draw attention to their similarities rather than pointing out their differences, which is what I find fascinating. But yes, you will, in many ways, you will see that they're two different. It's hard to, particularly with an Arctic landscape, it is very unique. But I did approach Svalbard at the end of summer, and that part of my project is, for that reason, also named 4 Days Before Winter, because I literally was there 4 days before winter. Winter arrived the day I flew out, and Svalbard was covered in snow for the next 8 to 9 months. But it revealed the landscape at its kind of most raw and barren, and kind of not the way we think of the Arctic on the postcards that we see. It also revealed the scarring from the resource industry that is there, from the coal mining. You know, the Arctic landscape or the glacial topography of Svalbard doesn't have a lot of vegetation. So any scarring on the land takes a very long time to heal, which is the opposite in many ways to Tasmania, which is, you know, it's very green and lush. And also, which is something I talk about in my projects, this idea of how these two places also bring into conversation about the concept of green ecology, that ecology is so much more than green. Green is a problem for Svalbard. Well, it's not. The day Tasmania stops being green, we're in trouble. The day that Svalbard becomes green, we're in trouble. So I've also been interested in the idea of the opposing kind of ecological concepts that we kind of tend to force upon how we think about environmental conversations.
So one of my favourite works is actually Set of Four, and it's a cyanotype of Ben Lomond Mountain, and then you've made a beautiful wash with the coal from Svalbard. Mm. So I think that would be a really good example of what you're saying about responding to the site in terms of how the material, you're working with the material. Now, in my own work, I interview people and spend time with people to work out or feel their connection to place. And then when I'm working in the landscape, I'm sort of embodying this collective feeling. Mm. But with it's you, as you said before, it's you, the camera and the landscape. And your images are incredibly emotive. So you're really putting yourself into the landscape. So in terms of that level of emotion, or they're incredibly beautiful and also incredibly heartbreaking in a way. They're very powerful. How would you think about that in terms of what you're bringing?
One of the areas that I did a lot of research on was the theme of melancholy. And I kind of came to that from two ends. I came from it being part of the psychology or psychological kind of cultural background of being Norwegian, where there is this kind of embedded or Nordic identity, I think it's probably better to call it, is this understanding that the world is put together by the happy experiences alongside a reflective melancholic space, that they need to be feed off each other for you to kind of be a completed person. So melancholy features heavy in Scandinavia as a kind of place of value. Of course, not to overdose on it is very important. And I think a lot of the ideas of, or even Scandi noir and all these kind of things comes from this place, but it's also highly dictated by seasons. Winter is generally, in those parts of the world, a melancholic space. But I also find the Anthropocene as a concept an inherently melancholic state. It's a foreboding, it's a challenging, it's a concept that is alluding to a problem that we are facing. So I think my work in that way of emotive is probably related very much to that it is impossible for me to make them without them being somewhat melancholic to the subject I'm approaching.
So in 2019, you co-created a symposium called Light Matter with ACP, and it was at UTS. So it was a really, you worked with some really strong artists. There was a curated show as well as this symposium, and it was exploring expanded photographic practice. Now, this is a landscape that's shifting very quickly. You know, you look at, sometimes I go and look at, because I'm teaching at UTAS, and I go and look at the art prizes, the finalists, to show the students what images are making the finals in particular years, like each year going back, just to see how the landscape is changing. And it's expanded photography's become the norm now, or the preference. So how do you see this field, especially when the symposium was 5 years ago now?
Yeah, so what we found doing that show, which was responding to what had come out of this digital revolution within photography, and photography being absolutely everywhere. And with that, when it kind of really took off, when we're going further back in time here, there was this fear of photography disappearing and becoming, not valued anymore and just losing its identity altogether. And what we found was that instead, it's just changed, and it has in some ways maybe grown stronger and gotten a much bigger, broader identity because it's been forced to. How do you stick out in a sea of imagery that we're surrounded with today? And it's forced artists to explore the medium beyond its two-dimensional meaning and find ways to navigate that new landscape around image making. And in many ways, I think that's quite interesting, and I think it's maybe even helped photography to establish itself stronger as a conceptual artistic medium, because it was long criticized and struggled with a placement in the art world because it had this one foot in the commercial world and one foot in the art making world. And I think it, in a way, has managed to, this has kind of forced it into really make a statement about itself, which I think is super interesting. So yes, the author isn't dead anymore. It didn't disappear, didn't vanish with analog photography. And it's kind of produced a really interesting new generation of artists. And I think it's just building on that today. I don't even actually think it's that different today than it was 5 years ago, because it's kind of has already done that explosion of kind of placing itself as we now call the expanded photographic field. And it just continues to do that invariably, because that's how art practices work. It needs to draw on historical things and build new on top of it continually to have a unique voice. It's part of all our practices is how do we take what we know and find a new way to speak about it, to draw attention to whatever it is the conversation we want to have with it.
Yeah. So it's in some ways become quite sculptural. It's become moving. Textiles have incorporated. It's really nudging against a lot of disciplines.
Mm. But the new discipline these days is interdiscipline. That goes for expanded paintings now and expanded sculpture. So it's if you go into academia, there is also, even there's this interdisciplinary degrees now and dialogues between scientists and philosophers and all this. So it kind of just follows a trend across a lot of fields of thinking and knowledge sharing and creativity. And I think it's no different in that way. But I think it has been forced to do that because the sheer volume and accessibility to photography today, it became hard to differentiate a work of art or getting any attraction or getting anyone to see anything that felt different from everything else they saw, which is difficult. But also can be interesting, and in many ways I think it has made it interesting.
Oh, it's pushing people, I think, to challenge and to be a bit more critical about what they're up to, and I think that can only be a positive thing.
Yeah.
Okay, well, that's a very inspiring way to finish, so thank you very much, Ellen, for coming along.
Thanks for having me. It was a really interesting conversation today.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you for listening to the 5th episode of Art Destinations Tasmania. Be reminded about our next episode by subscribing to our fortnightly newsletter on our website artdestinations.org. I'm your host, Sarah Rhodes. Ciao for now.